Recording begins. Galactic date 47,392.6. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all dimensional planes, this is Zyxtar, bringing you the most extraordinary coverage of what turned out to be the most mind-bending match in the history of the Galactic Combat Championships. Even now, 3 solar cycles later, my fourth stomach still churns when I recall the events of that fateful evening. For those tuning in from the outer spiral arms, you might be wondering why a veteran sports commentator with 27 years of experience would still be talking about a single match. Well, grab your gravity stabilizers, because this story will knock you right out of orbit. The scene: the Grand Coliseum of New Venus, packed with 900,000 spectators from 12,000 different species. The air was thick with anticipation, and various atmospheric processors were working overtime to handle the excess emotional pheromones being released by the crowd. The betting boards were lighting up like a supernova, with odds so ridiculous that even the quantitian math lords were having trouble calculating them. I remember sitting in my hovering commentary booth, all 6 of my eyes focused on the pristine combat arena below. The force field shimmer was particularly beautiful that evening, creating rainbow ripples across the 200-meter diameter fighting space. My producer, Tzak, was frantically waving his sensory tentacles, trying to get me to start the pre-match commentary. But how could I? How could anyone maintain professional composure when we were about to witness what should have been the most one-sided match in championship history? The defending champion versus, well, we'll get to that particular surprise in a moment. The VIP boxes were filled with the galaxy's elite. The Supreme Chancellor of the Andromeda Alliance had even suspended his hibernation cycle to attend. The Hive Queens of Sector 7 had sent their entire royal court. Even the notoriously reclusive time merchants had bought out an entire section. Their temporal displacement fields, causing that corner of the arena to experience 5 different versions of the same evening simultaneously. The security was unprecedented. 4 layers of photon guards, 6 squadrons of neural disruptors, and even a couple of reality anchors to prevent any interdimensional interference. Not that anyone expected trouble. This was supposed to be a formal execution, dressed up as a sport event. At least, that's what we all thought. The betting commissioner, Huxpor, was practically glowing with satisfaction, his bioluminescent patches flashing in sync with the increasing credit transfers. The odds were stacked so high against the challenger that several banking AIs had to be brought online just to handle the calculations. Looking back now, I should have noticed the warning signs. The unusual calm in the challenger's preparation chamber. The nervous twitching of the medical team's diagnostic appendages. The way the arena's quantum predictors kept shorting out whenever they tried to calculate possible match outcomes. But I was too caught up in the spectacle, too sure of what was about to unfold. Oh, how wonderfully wrong I was. Let me tell you about Vor'thak, the so-called blade of infinite edges. When they say he's undefeated, they don't just mean in our regular 3-dimensional space. No. This magnificent being had mastered combat across 12 different dimensional planes simultaneously. Born on the warrior world of Kethlar Prime, where the gravity is 10 times stronger than Earth standard, Vor'thak emerged from his hatching pod already gripping a plasma sword. That's not an exaggeration. The nursery attendants had to call in a special weapons expert just to pry it from his infant claws. His early victories were impressive enough. At age 15, he won the Junior Galactic Championships by defeating opponents while blindfolded, using only his auxiliary sensory spines to detect their movements. By 20, he had mastered the art of fighting in zero gravity, underwater, and in temporal displacement fields, sometimes all at once. But what really set Vor'thak apart was his revolutionary discovery of multidimensional combat techniques. You see, most warriors can only perceive and fight in 3, maybe 4 dimensions at most. Vor'thak? He developed a fighting style that utilized all 12 dimensions recognized by the Galactic Sport Federation. I was there for his most famous match against the legendary Kazin sisters, triplet warriors who had dominated the circuit for decades. Vor'thak didn't just beat them, he existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. His sword strikes coming from places that shouldn't technically exist. The match lasted exactly 2.3 seconds, and by the end, the Kazin sisters had somehow been defeated last week, tomorrow, and 3 parallel realities to the left. His signature move, the Quantum Blade Cascade. became the most studied combat technique in history. Scholars from the Pentagon Nebula's War College spent entire careers trying to understand how he could split his consciousness across 7 temporal planes while maintaining perfect sword form in all of them. The numbers speak for themselves: 3,427 matches, 3,427 victories, 0 draws, 0 losses. 8 different species officially declared him a minor deity. The probability monks of Tau Ceti actually revised their fundamental beliefs about certainty after witnessing his 100th consecutive victory. Training? Vor'thak's regular routine involved fighting holograms in a chamber where physics itself took a coffee break. He would practice sword forms while quantum tunneling between dimensions, his blade existing in multiple probability states at once. The practice arena had to be rebuilt 6 times because reality itself couldn't handle his training sessions. Even the Synthetic Intelligence Coalition, with their perfect combat algorithms and millisecond reaction times, refused to spar with him after he somehow managed to parry attacks before they were even calculated. The official report just read combat analysis impossible. Subject appears to be breaking causality itself. And his sword. Oh, what a marvel of engineering! The Star Splitter, as he called it, was forged from metals that technically didn't exist in our universe. The blade could cut through force fields like they were wet paper. And rumor had it that he once accidentally sliced a black hole in half during a particularly intense training session. But perhaps most terrifying was his absolute confidence. In 20 years of covering his matches, I never once saw him show concern about an opponent. Why would he? His mastery of multidimensional combat meant he had already seen every possible way a fight could end before it even began. When asked about his success in a rare interview, he famously said, "Victory is not a possibility, it is merely a different perspective of an already existing certainty." Nobody really understood what he meant. But it sounded impressive enough that it became the motto of 3 different warrior cultures. So when the match against the human was announced, the only question anyone asked was whether Vor'thak would end it in under or over 1 second. After all, what chance did any opponent have against someone who could literally attack from next Tuesday? Oh, how gloriously wrong we all were. And then there was Jack Morrison. When he first walked into the registration chamber, the processing clerk thought it was some sort of elaborate prank. Standing there in a white chef's coat, still spotted with what we later learned was called tomato sauce, holding nothing but what he called a santoku knife. The registration AI actually glitched and had to reboot 3 times while trying to process his application. Here was a human, not even wearing proper combat gear, wanting to challenge the greatest swordsman in 12 dimensions. The clerk, poor Pitula, even called me down to verify this wasn't some sort of elaborate entertainment segment for our broadcast. "Yeah, I'd like to enter the championship," he said, casually sharpening his kitchen knife while leaning against the registration desk. "Got some time off from the restaurant." Figured why not? Those words still echo in my audio receptors to this day. As if he was signing up for a local cooking contest rather than a potentially fatal combat sport. The background check on him was almost insultingly mundane. Head chef at the Hungry Nebula, a moderately successful Earth restaurant in the Galactic Trade District of New Shanghai. No combat training, no military background, not even a parking violation. His most notable achievement was winning the Solar System Food Network's Best Fusion Cuisine Award 3 years running. When word got out about his registration, the entertainment networks went into a frenzy. Talk show hosts across 17 star systems had field days with jokes about bringing a knife to a sword fight, though they clearly missed the irony that he was, technically, doing exactly that. The pre-match interview was unique. While other challengers typically spoke of honor, glory, or complex combat philosophies, Jack just stood there, checking the edge of his knife against his thumbnail. "You know," he said, "you'd be surprised how similar cutting through a tough piece of meat is to, well, anything really." The medical team was particularly concerned. Dr. Waxtal, head of the arena's emergency response unit, practically begged him to at least wear standard protective gear. Jack's response? He patted the doctor's tentacle and said, "Nah, this coat's got me through worse kitchen rushes. Plus, it's stain-resistant." The betting odds against him reached such astronomical levels that several galactic banking systems had to invent new numbers just to display them. The probability monks who had previously been challenged by Vor'thak's perfection now found themselves questioning their sanity rather than their faith. During the mandatory weapons inspection, the security chief, a veteran of 3 galactic wars, actually started crying with laughter when Jack presented his knife. The chief wheezed through his primary breathing apparatus. "This is what you're bringing against the Star Splitter," Jack just shrugged and said, "It's really good at julienning vegetables." The pre-match preparation was equally baffling. While Vor'thak was performing his traditional 12-dimensional warm-up routine in his chamber, Jack was cooking. He'd somehow convinced the arena staff to let him set up a small prep station in his waiting area. The security feeds showed him perfectly dicing onions and explaining proper knife technique to the increasingly bewildered guard detail. Perhaps the most telling moment came during the mandatory psychological evaluation. The arena's chief psychiatrist, after a full hour of examination, simply wrote either the most zen being I've ever encountered or completely unaware of reality, unable to determine which is more concerning. Even I, with all my years of professional neutrality, couldn't help but feel a mix of pity and secondhand embarrassment. Here was a being who was, by all accounts, about to become the most memorable statistical footnote in championship history. The only question was whether he'd be remembered as the fastest defeat or the most bizarre contestant. None of us knew we were about to witness something that would fundamentally change how the galaxy viewed both human beings and kitchen utensils. The final minutes before the match were, to put it mildly, absolute pandemonium. The betting commissioner, Hux Poor, was having all 8 of his coronary organs monitored by medical staff as the wagers reached levels that threatened to destabilize the galactic economy. Several smaller star systems had actually bet their entire planetary GDPs on Vor'thak. In the VIP lounge, the quantum odds calculators were smoking from overload. One particularly prestigious bookie was offering odds of 999,999,999,999 to 1 against Jack, and still people were betting on Vor'thak. The time merchants, usually the most conservative of gamblers, had placed bets across 16 different temporal lines, all on Vor'thak winning in under 3 seconds. But something strange started happening in the final hour before the match. The arena's empathic sensors, usually buzzing with the typical pre-match excitement, began picking up an unusual emotion: anxiety. Not from Jack, oh no, but from everyone else, you see. Jack's complete and utter calm was starting to unnerve people. The security feeds from his preparation chamber showed him methodically arranging and rearranging his knife kit the way a painter might organize their brushes. He'd occasionally test the knife's edge against a piece of paper, nodding satisfactorily as it sliced through with surgical precision. No prayers, no meditation, no last-minute training, just prep work. Even the veteran arena staff were getting spooked. P. Tula, the same clerk who'd processed his registration, actually called in sick after watching Jack casually sharpen his knife while humming something he called classic rock. The chief of security ordered 3 additional reality scanners, convinced this had to be some sort of elaborate deception. In Vor'thak's chamber, for the first time in his career, the champion demanded to see the surveillance feeds of his opponent. The recording shows him pausing his 12-dimensional warm-up routine. All 4 of his primary eyes fixed on the screen, showing Jack demonstrating proper grip technique to a fascinated cleaning drone. The arena's quantum predictors, sophisticated machines that could calculate the outcome of most matches with 99.99% accuracy, kept spitting out error messages. The head technician's report, simply "Rid machine refuses to compute," claims data set is too absurd to process. 10 minutes before the match, something unprecedented happened. The Hive Queens, those ancient beings who could taste lies in the air, began to shift uncomfortably in their royal box. Their empathic guards were picking up absolutely nothing from Jack: not fear, not excitement, not even the basic survival instinct that every living being should have when facing certain doom. 5 minutes out, and the time merchants were seen frantically trying to hedge their bets across different timelines. Something about the temporal probability streams around Jack was making them nervous. One was overheard saying, "It's like trying to predict the future of a void." In the commentary booth, my producer T-Zach was having a mild breakdown. The script he'd prepared for what should have been a record-breaking shortest match was starting to feel wrong. I remember him muttering, "Nobody can be this calm before their own execution. Nobody." The final minute ticked down. Through the arena speakers, we could hear Jack's last words before heading to the combat floor. Just like preparing for a busy Friday night service, the medical team exchanged worried glances. Surely this human was in some sort of shock. As the entrance gates began to open, the entire arena held its breath. Vor'thak emerged from his chamber in full battle regalia, the star splitter humming with enough power to slice a starship in half. And from the other gate came Jack, adjusting his chef's coat, holding his kitchen knife with the casual comfort of someone about to dice vegetables for soup. That's when it hit me we weren't the ones causing anxiety in Jack. Jack was causing anxiety in us, and we were about to find out why. The ceremonial gong hadn't even finished reverberating through the arena when Vor'thak launched his first attack, a classic 12-dimensional thrust that had ended 847 previous matches in under a second. The crowd gasped, certain they were about to witness the shortest championship bout in history. But something impossible happened. Jack simply wasn't there. He'd taken a small step sideways, the same casual movement a chef makes to reach for salt, and Vor'thak's blade cut through empty space across 11 different dimensions. "Whoops, hot pan coming through," Jack said, as if he was navigating a busy kitchen rather than dodging certain death. The champion's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. In 20 years, nobody had ever treated his attacks like they were minor inconveniences. Vor'thak unleashed his infamous quantum blade cascade, existing in 7 places simultaneously, his sword creating a lethal web of energy that should have been impossible to escape. Jack's response: he moved through the gaps with the same precision he'd used to navigate between busy line cooks during dinner rush. The audience was stunned into silence. The champion's attacks, which had overwhelmed master fighters and combat eyes alike, were being casually avoided by a human who looked more concerned about scuffing his shoes than saving his life. "You're overreaching," Jack commented, ducking under a horizontal slash that cut through 3 separate timelines. "Just like my new prep cook. Everyone always wants to make big, fancy moves. Sometimes smaller is better." He demonstrated this philosophy by deflecting a plasma blade with nothing more than a perfectly angled kitchen knife. Vor'thak, visibly frustrated, shifted into his higher dimensional forms, his body splitting across multiple planes of reality. It was a technique that had driven several opponents mad just trying to comprehend it. Jack's response reminds me of prep work, dealing with multiple orders at once. You just need to keep your station organized. The champion's next sequence was a blur of motion that existed in past, present, and future simultaneously. Quantum physics itself seemed to protest as the star splitter carved wounds in reality. Yet somehow, Jack's movements remained efficient and economical, like a chef working in a small kitchen where every inch of space matters. "See, your problem is," Jack said, parrying a blow that could have split a planet. "You're treating this like a sword fight. I'm treating it like a busy service. And buddy, I've handled Saturday night rushes that were way more chaotic than this." The medical team was having collective nervous breakdowns. Their instruments showed that Jack's heart rate hadn't elevated above what you'd expect during a mild workout. He was expending less energy avoiding multidimensional death than most beings use walking to their transport pods. In the commentary booth, I'd completely abandoned my prepared script. How do you commentate on a match where one competitor is treating reality-shattering attacks like they're minor workplace hazards? The champion of 12 dimensions was being outmaneuvered by someone whose combat strategy seemed based entirely on kitchen workflow management. Vor'thak launched into his stellar cataclysm technique, a move that required special clearance from the Physics Regulatory Board. The arena's reality stabilizers were working overtime as space itself began to warp. Jack's response? He adjusted his stance slightly, the same way he'd shift his weight during a long prep session. "You know," Jack called out, while casually stepping through a gap in causality itself. "This reminds me of that time during the New Year's Eve service when both our main ovens went down." Now that was pressure. The champion's secondary eyes twitched in what I can only describe as complete bafflement. The first phase of combat ended with an unprecedented scene. Vor'thak, the undefeated master of 12 dimensions, had not landed a single hit. his opponent, rather than being reduced to quantum particles scattered across multiple realities, was calmly testing his knife's edge against his thumbnail. The mandatory 1-minute break between phases found both competitors in very different states. Vor'thak was consulting with his team of quantum strategists, all of them gesturing frantically at holographic battle projections. Jack? He was asking a thoroughly confused arena attendant if anyone wanted coffee, because he noticed the break room machine on his way in, and it looked like it made a decent brew. Nobody in the arena could quite believe what they were witnessing. The time merchants were seen frantically checking their temporal instruments, convinced we had somehow slipped into an alternate reality. The probability monks had entered a state of collective meditation, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with their fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality. As the second phase was about to begin, I caught a glimpse of something that should have warned us all about what was coming. Jack had that same look I'd seen on master chefs right before they turned an ordinary meal into a masterpiece. The second phase began with something none of us had ever seen before. Vor'thak was showing signs of frustration. His normally perfect quantum field was fluctuating, his secondary eyes blinking out of sync, the equivalent of a champion boxer dropping their guard. "You know what your problem is," Jack said, weaving through a barrage of strikes that were literally bending time. "You're thinking too much about looking good. In a kitchen, nobody cares how pretty you look while dicing onions. They just care that the onions are diced." Each word seemed to unsettle Vor'thak more. The champion's legendary precision was giving way to increasingly desperate attacks. His 12-dimensional patterns, usually as perfect as atomic clockwork, began showing gaps. Not large ones, just small imperfections, like tiny cracks in a master's blade. "Take this stance you keep using," Jack continued, smoothly sidestepping an attack that should have hit him across 3 different timelines. "Very flashy, very impressive. But you're working twice as hard as you need to. Just like those cooking show contestants who spin their knives around for the cameras." The champion's response was to launch into his most devastating combination. The infinity spiral death blossom, the arena's safety fields, maxed out as reality itself began to twist. But Jack, he treated the laws of physics breaking attack like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience during dinner rush. "See, now you're just showing off," Jack commented, deflecting a quantum blade with his knife while adjusting his chef's cap. "In my kitchen, the ones who try to show off usually end up cutting themselves. Keep it simple, keep it clean, get the job done." Something in those words struck a nerve. Vor'thak's next attack pattern became almost reckless, a cardinal sin in 12-dimensional combat. The champion was fighting like someone who'd suddenly realized their textbook no longer made sense. The turning point came when Jack actually started giving Vor'thak cooking tips mid-fight. "Your grip's all wrong," he said, demonstrating proper knife technique while avoiding a reality-splitting slash. "You're going to get carpal tunnel syndrome holding it like that. Here, watch how I do it." In the VIP boxes, the quantum combat theorists were having collective existential crises. One of them was repeatedly banging his head against his datapad, muttering, "The kitchen analogy shouldn't work. The kitchen analogy cannot work." But it was working. With each passing moment, Vor'thak's legendary form deteriorated further. His attacks, while still lethal enough to vaporize a small moon, were becoming predictable. The champion was fighting like someone who'd spent their whole life mastering a language, only to suddenly find out they'd been mispronouncing every word. "Last warning about that grip," Jack said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd use with a stubborn apprentice. "You're gonna hurt yourself, and I don't mean by me. That's a repetitive stress injury waiting to happen." The arena fell into a stunned silence as the implications became clear. The greatest swordsman in 12 dimensions was being lectured on proper blade handling by a human chef. And worse, much worse, the chef was making sense. That's when we all realized what was about to happen. The final phase wasn't going to be a test of combat skills. It was going to be a lesson in knife work, and Vor'thak was about to become the student. What happened next will be debated in combat schools across the galaxy for centuries to come. The final sequence began with Vor'thak launching his ultimate technique, the one that had earned him his title, the Infinite Edge Convergence. Every dimension he could access became a blade. Every point in space a potential strike. Jack's response, he sighed. the same way a veteran chef sighs when seeing a rookie mistake. "All right," he said, rolling his shoulders, "let me show you how we handle rush hour at the Hungry Nebula." What followed was, well, imagine watching a master chef break down a complex dish into simple, efficient movements. Only instead of ingredients, Jack was dismantling the most sophisticated combat technique ever developed. Each of Vor'thak's dimensional strikes was met with basic knife work principles. "First, you establish your workspace," Jack explained, creating a bubble of calm in the chaos by simply controlling the space around him, just as a chef controls their station. "Then you mise en place everything in its place." He began systematically closing off dimensional angles, treating quantum attack vectors like ingredients that needed organizing. Vor'thak's assault, which had overwhelmed quantum supercomputers, was being countered by what Jack called basic kitchen awareness: hot behind, sharp coming through. Corner. He called out each movement like he was navigating a busy kitchen, making the champion's attacks seem as manageable as a dinner service. "Now, about that grip of yours," Jack said, his knife meeting the star splitter in a clash that sent dimensional ripples across the arena. "Here's how we teach proper technique at culinary school in one fluid motion." He demonstrated a perfect pinch grip, and somehow used it to redirect a blow that could have split a solar system. The champion's growing panic was visible across all dimensional planes. His attacks became increasingly desperate, each one met with nothing more than basic cooking techniques. "Cross-contamination," Jack called out, smoothly separating Vor'thak's quantum blade streams like he was organizing raw and cooked ingredients. The arena's reality stabilizers were screaming as Vor'thak poured more power into the star splitter. The blade now existed in all possible states simultaneously, a weapon that could theoretically cut through anything. Jack's response reminds me of trying to slice over ripe tomatoes. The trick is to let the knife do the work. And then came the moment that changed everything. Jack shifted his grip slightly, moved his feet into what he later called proper kitchen stance, and said, "Watch the wrist action here. This is how you prevent fatigue during long prep sessions." What happened next broke several laws of physics and caused 3 different schools of quantum combat theory to close permanently. Jack's kitchen knife, moving with nothing more than perfect culinary technique, somehow found the exact point where all of Vor'thak's dimensional attacks converged. "See," Jack said, his blade sliding through the quantum field like it was nothing more than a particularly tough cut of meat. No wasted movement, no fancy flourishes, just clean, precise cuts. The star splitter, the most powerful weapon in 12 dimensions, clattered to the ground. Vor'thak stood frozen, all 4 of his primary eyes wide with disbelief, as Jack's simple kitchen knife rested gently against the champion's throat. "And that," Jack said, in the same tone he'd used to finish a cooking demonstration, "is why proper knife technique is the foundation of everything we do in the kitchen." The arena erupted into chaos. The probability monks were openly weeping. The time merchants were frantically checking if we'd somehow slipped into an alternate reality. The quantum combat theorists had collectively given up and were heading to the nearest bar. As the medical team rushed in, Jack was already wiping his knife clean with his kitchen towel. "Anyone hungry?" he asked the stunned officials. "All this dimensional combat works up an appetite, and I noticed your cafeteria could use some help with their menu." And just like that, the greatest sword fight in galactic history ended with a cooking lesson. The galaxy's most sophisticated warrior had been defeated by nothing more than perfect knife technique and kitchen wisdom. 3 solar cycles later. And I'm still trying to process what I witnessed that day. The footage has been analyzed by every combat expert in the galaxy. Quantum physicists have written thousands of papers trying to explain how basic kitchen techniques defeated 12-dimensional sword mastery. Not one of them has come up with a satisfactory explanation. Vor'thak, the formerly undefeated champion, retired from competition and, in a twist that still makes me question reality, enrolled in culinary school. Last I heard, he's working as a sous chef in Jack's restaurant, learning the proper way to hold a knife. His former opponents find this more terrifying than his combat career. The betting aftermath nearly collapsed 3 galactic economies. Huxpor, the betting commissioner, had to be placed in suspended animation for a week, while his various cardiac systems recovered. The time merchants suffered their largest loss in 4,000 years. though they claim they'll make it back yesterday. But the real changes came in how we view humans. The Galactic Combat Federation had to create entirely new classification categories because humans simply didn't fit into any existing combat paradigms. How do you classify a species that approaches multidimensional combat the same way they approach preparing dinner? The Quantum Combat Academy completely rewrote their curriculum. They now require all students to work in a busy restaurant kitchen for at least one solar cycle before beginning their training. The dropout rate has skyrocketed, with many promising warriors quitting after their first Friday night dinner service. Jack? He went back to his restaurant the next day, acting like nothing extraordinary had happened. When pressed for interviews about his revolutionary combat techniques, he just shrugs and says, "If you can handle a Saturday night dinner rush with half your staff out sick and a broken dishwasher, you can handle pretty much anything." The probability monks have added a new chapter to their sacred texts, simply titled The Human Variable. It's the only chapter that begins with a question mark and ends with a shrug. They've also started incorporating kitchen work into their meditation practices. Though several monasteries have burned down during attempts to master mindful flambéing, security forces across the galaxy have had to revise their weapons screening protocols. Every kitchen implement is now treated as a potential quantum-level threat. You should see the panic that ensues when someone pulls out a potato peeler in a public space. The official match recording has become the most studied piece of footage in combat history. Combat schools now spend entire semesters analyzing Jack's footwork, trying to understand how simple kitchen navigation translated so perfectly to dimensional combat. The leading theory is that humans evolved their spatial awareness by trying not to bump into each other in small kitchens. But perhaps the most profound change has been in how the galaxy views human customs and traditions. Every seemingly mundane human activity is now studied with intense scrutiny. Last week, a team of xenoanthropologists published a 9,000-page analysis of human parallel parking, convinced it must contain some hidden martial wisdom. As for me, I've changed too. I no longer prejudge any competitor based on their background or weapons. I've learned that sometimes the most profound martial wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. I've also started taking cooking classes, though I've been asked to never return to 3 different culinary schools. When asked about his victory during his only post-match interview, Jack said something that I think perfectly captures why humans are now both respected and feared across the galaxy. Everything you need to know about life, you can learn in a kitchen. High pressure, sharp objects, hot surfaces, tight spaces, and if you mess up, somebody probably goes hungry. After that, everything else is just details. The Galactic Combat Championships continue, but they've never been quite the same. Every time a new champion emerges, they inevitably face the same question: yes, but could you handle dinner rush at a busy restaurant? And somewhere in New Shanghai, in a modest restaurant called the Hungry Nebula, the greatest swordsman in 12 dimensions is learning how to properly julienne vegetables, while his human teacher reminds him to watch his fingers and maintain proper knife technique. Some say we should have seen it coming. After all, what better preparation for handling the chaos of dimensional combat than managing the controlled chaos of a professional kitchen? But then again, that's the thing about humans. They're always finding new ways to remind the galaxy that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most profound. This is Zextar, signing off. And if you'll excuse me, I have a dinner reservation at the Hungry Nebula. I hear they're serving something called humble pie as today's special.